Welcome, everybody, to part 2 of our energetic self-mastery class, illuminating the ins and outs of inner darkness and shadow, a very interesting subject that, with the continuation of the energetic self-mastery classes here, shows the complexity of some of these subjects, which can no longer, when holistically seen, be broken down in just the simple physical, emotional, mental, social, spiritual, and energetic mechanics. We have to take a deeper look. We have to take a deeper look inside our own inner darkness to better understand the holistic causes as well as the potential roadmaps and remedies that we can apply to counteract some of the symptoms that come with, suffering from an inner darkness, dark night of the soul, and darkness that we feel is in us or comes at us, and also the expressions in form of our shadow. So that said, I wanted to commend all of you for participating and so beautifully sharing here in the part number 1, where we basically spend the time with really feeling into what darkness in us feels like. And I don't know if you've had the time, it's been 3 weeks since we did the part 1. If you had the time to re-listen to some of your own sharings perhaps, and see sort of what it was that we were able to work out there together. We looked at darkness. We also learned what higher learning really means, namely to witness those inner processes while we're experiencing, to not be afraid of experiencing them, and to identify, and this is very subjective, these illusions of darkness. And with it also, and this was the interesting part of our part 1, experiencing our inner light, experiencing the part in us, the self-healing part, the higher power in us that basically naturally works against our inner darkness. So obviously, in mainstream media or movies, these are typically presented through the forces of light and the forces of dark, the dark side of the force or the light side of the force, Star Wars and so forth. Those are all archetypal representations of how we regard and perceive light and dark. And just to warm up a little bit here, we've went through the different aspects within ourselves, specific states and attitudes that we in that way began to recontextualize and classify them in a different way. So we've basically came to the conclusion or insight, if you will, that really all our ego states in which we are either blinded or the perception of a certain situation creates a strong reactivity in us when we're not regarding a situation with the whole self, with just aspects of ourselves, fragmented parts. And we're going to dive a little deeper into the causes of that today, but we could basically work out together here that our perceptions of darkness, that they increase with, the lower our energy goes, the less energy or less life force we subjectively experience. And that it requires a certain level of perception, namely the ability to actually feel what is true, to discern this. to even have the counter experience, namely the experience of truth, at least, which is when we begin to understand things. This is what allows us to have compassion, to have understanding, for certain things. And we left off here, and also had very significant or relevant personal experiences when we did the energy alignment with our expressions of light. So it just the mere understanding, let's say the theoretical understanding or the knowledge of what darkness and shadow is, does not really prevent us from becoming a victim of our own, or to witness our own inner darkness or shadow. So it isn't until we really know how to feel into our inner light and know how to connect with it when needed, to really feel competent, to really feel like we can do something about it in us. All right. So I've compared darkness with a virus last time, and it's like, something that spreads in us if we don't catch it early enough, because it will replicate. It will literally replicate through all aspects of our lives, and it will, with that, then create a context or a framework for our life that is rather pessimistic and hostile, even, which then basically promotes our own powerlessness, so makes it even harder to do anything about it. And we did go into the investigation here with ourselves through this self-reflection. What is our darkness even linked to? What is the fear that is there? I guess fear is the most common denominator that we can all can identify, that when it comes to darkness, the first and predominant feeling or sensation or emotion or even thought is fear. And we've tried to recreate this within ourselves, um, that can allow us, not the darkness in ourselves, but the steps, like how we get pulled into our inner darkness, and how this downward spiral then comes to play. What it actually is that we are afraid of. And there were some phrases such as think the thought all the way to the end, say it out loud, admit your fear to yourself, right? What is it actually that we are afraid of? Is it a loss? Is it a loss of control, maybe loss of our own life? Our mortality is very, very fitting right now, as we are all in the midst of this COVID-19 situation and lockdowns and so forth. And through admitting this to ourselves, and really taking a look at it without getting pulled into it, then ultimately experience that we actually have a choice here. We can choose if we want to energize darkness or if we want to energize light in us. But we also came to the conclusion that if we don't really have a reference feeling for our inner self-healing power, that light power in us, right, and we don't even know it exists, then it's very difficult to know that we have a choice. Now, some of us, and this is the interesting part here with this group of self-healers and healers, have a reference feeling for their inner light. But what was the problem there? We recognize that when we are below a certain threshold, it's almost like we forgot that we can connect with our inner light. So the energy alignment, which by now I have recorded for you in an MP3 that you can use. Energy alignments are not the same as energy processes. I want to just point this out again. They're more like affirmations. They work on a mental level, more on a mental level, but help us, through the recontextualization, the reframing that can take place, through that to remember, to recall our inner light. So when I just, took this part of the invocation or the alignment here as a representation of that, when I find myself in darkness, I lost connection to my inner light to teach me what separates me from the source of my own existence. It sounds a bit mental, but it all leads to the same fear, namely that when we are finding ourselves in darkness, we are experiencing the loss of connection with our light. So, in other words, darkness then begins to appear as something a little more tangible, really, namely simply the absence of light. And the question now for self-healer and healer is, how can I, either myself or a patient, oftentimes this happens simultaneously, reconnect with the light? How can I help a person to even know that there's something like light in them, even if they cannot feel it or see it at a given moment? Like on a cloudy day or at night when we cannot see the sun, it's obviously, that we've learned that every morning the sun rises and every evening the sun sets, and we kind of got used to this. We take this for granted. So there's a trust in us that the sun will rise the next day, even if it's really, really pitch dark at night. But psychologically, we seem to forget this sometimes. And as a healer and self-healer, this should then be the main focus of any kind of healing strategy or roadmap, namely to help a person to reconnect with their light. And if the person does not even have a reference for what this inner light, this inner connection feels like, well, then that means we have to help ourselves or the person to have this experience first. Because otherwise, all the talk about the light and, sort of, choosing and all that are just concepts. Okay, they need to be experienced. So overcoming inner darkness and the renderings of that, which shadow is a part of it, and we're going to go into shadow a little more today, is really the process of learning how to connect with our light. Because darkness is the temporary experience of the absence or the missing connection, the separation, as we call this in energy work, from our light. And it leads to basically the worst case scenario for our psyche, namely the connection with the source of my own existence. In other words, I no longer trust in the fact that I exist. It's like you lose all trust that the sun will rise the next morning. It's like it's dark and it's going to stay dark forever. If you can sort of feel yourself into that feeling, right? And this is when you feel separated from your own source or from your source of existence, because you don't know if you will ever see the sun or the light again. You're separated from that source, and somebody who's connected, even just a little bit, will have this faith, will have this hope, will have this trust that the light is still there. And in severe cases of lost connection, separation from the source of all existence, the darkness can become so dense and so thick that it will appear that life itself is dark. in the world and everything in it. At this level of darkness, at this level of loss of connection with the source of our own existence, which is basically divine, the divine creation, we then speak of true darkness, like a form of evilness, where we no longer believe in creation, in the divine, in the light. We see everything just as a manifestation of darkness, and the logic then is that we have to be darker than darkness. Okay, so we have to become even darker, okay, to survive. We cannot prevent our ego, that is the survival mechanism in us, to trying to master whatever it is that we find ourselves in. So if I see or find myself in a dark place that is very, very dark, my ego will then suggest to be even darker, so that I can feel at least the illusion of a control or of a connection with something. And at that place, at that truly dark place, the connection to darkness itself, if you will, the Luciferian, or in our sort of Christian or religious archetypal context, the Satan or devil or something like that, will then perceived as healing, will then perceived as the savior. So this is just the sort of intro here into what is light, what is dark, what is darkness, and how we, can place ego and shadow and evilness and all this. We'll go through this today, how to place this within this whole realm. And I want to open up the discussion with you here and into sharing, obviously, because this is a self-mastery class, meaning there was of course, a sort of a teaching, a theoretical part to it, but this one in particular, due to its complexity, is very important to be discussed because of the multitude of renderings. Yeah, so Cindy is correctly concluding. So it's all about connection. Correct. It's all about connection. The question is, what do we connect to? And in energy work, we often frame this as, what do we align ourselves to? And as we have discovered here in the first part of this self-mastery class, what we align ourselves to, well, has a lot to do with the perception of the state that we are in. All right, if I'm very, very angry and I'm like literally overtaken by anger, I will not just feel angry myself, I will also see other people as such. If I am in a state of damnation and I feel damned, no reason to live, it doesn't even matter, there's no point, life in and of itself is not even real, yeah, then I am no longer able to perceive any kind of life in anything that I look at, be it a tree or a person or a child or even a puppy or a kitty. They usually work with us humans. So I want to ask you guys, if you have ever experienced, just so that we can see what our scope of experience is, have you ever experienced a state in which you could not see anything worth living for? You couldn't see any beauty, any love, any nothing, nothing divine, nothing bigger, all right, that it would possibly be worth for living in your life. Have you experienced this, where everything that you look at is just another version of darkness for you, and even other people kissing or expressing love is all just fake, and it's all just, I don't want to give words here, but it's ugly, or it's like not even true.
Hey
Does
there.
anybody want to share? Yeah, hi. Hi, Cindy.
Hi.
Thanks for breaking the ice here.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one. You have nailed it from the get-go here. I'll just give you a little background. As you know, I basically came into this incarnation in fear, and I
Hmm.
knew nothing else.
Right.
And going through childhood and going through adolescence, adulthood, when you explain this, I understand it because you can see exactly what you're talking about. People kissing the tree, but
Hmm.
you can't feel it. And that
Hmm.
was the difference, is that I understood, but I didn't feel it. All I could feel was the fear. And that's all I knew. It wasn't until I was able to experience something else and really start having those experiences did I know I had a choice.
So, Cindy, let me ask you, you are a healer, okay? So what was this experience in your life? This is different for each and every one of us. And it's typically not one event. It is something like an inner prompting or something that pulls us into, either wanting to experience something or sometimes through crises, forcing us to experience something. But now looking back at your own healing process, your own self-healing process, what can you boil down? What can you boil this down to? What helped you to experience or to feel this light in you? Maybe, it was an event for you, or maybe it was a process. Maybe it was a series of unfortunate events. Like for most of us, it is.
Yeah, which one do you want to hear about? No, just kidding. But it started literally in my mid 40s. I didn't know what they were at the time, but they were actually true self promptings. I
Uh-huh.
would get messages to read something or watch something, and it would trigger something inside of me, almost like a little treasure map. So I would follow the promptings without any clue as to what I was getting myself into.
Mhm.
But I just trusted and went with it because it was the feeling. It was the mental process was not coherent. So basically, I know that now as holographic information was coming in, and my mind just could not decode it. But there was a part of me that propelled me into following it. And, long story short, it got me through to, certain teachings and then to here where I really was able to learn how to do it, how to connect and have that experience. And it was life changing, absolutely life changing.
Now, in your example, and this is common, although not everybody has it this way, like these strong inner promptings. And you've also shared that you've had some like dreams or experiences that somehow kind of brought, like in your case, you shared like Jesus or something appeared in front of you. Or for some people it's angels, or spirit animals, or in your case, here you also shared a sudden knowing. Okay. Now, how did this? Oh, this is Denise. Denise, you're logged in as Cindy, just so you know.
Oh, you know why? Because I sent her the link. She couldn't
You,
get
oh,
on.
I see. Oh, that's funny. Okay, so everything I just said is what Denise said.
Yeah, that
But
kind of
it
threw me for a second. I'm like, huh?
but it ties in. So not everybody has this. So consciously as inner promptings, often it's the retrospect, right, where we can identify, oh, now I remember I had these like really weird notions as a child or as a teenager, or I've always been attracted to this or that. But what I was going to ask you, Denise, is sorry, Cindy, um, is when you first started following these inner promptings, did this feel like it would help you? Did it feel enlightening, or did it actually kind of make it worse at times?
Oh, it was terrible at times because once that part of me agreed to do this, it opened up a lot of stuff that I didn't understand. I could see darkness, I could feel darkness. It's like I had to work through that before I could get to the light, just like you talk about clearing the
Mhm.
clouds. So, yeah, I had to be ready, or a part of me had to be ready to work through that. And it sometimes, especially in the beginning when I had no idea, what was happening, what was going on, what I was experiencing. And I'll say straight up, was absolutely terrifying at times. But once
So
I
it's not a
went,
straight line. That's what I wanted to point out, right?
yeah,
It's not like, oh, and then you read one thing and then you're a little wiser, and then you read another thing and you're a little feel a little better. It doesn't really go that way. It's like it
yeah,
feels like a
no,
really straight road, right?
yes,
And the confrontation then, with your own fears, with your own darkness, at first feels overwhelming, right?
yes,
This is something that we all need to really understand about the process. Facing our inner darkness, and also, the aspects such as shadow and ego, which we will untangle this a little bit today, is it's just almost like a matter of life and death. I mean, it is probably the most difficult process ever for our psyche, because we have so many protection mechanisms in play that prevent us from doing that. That literally so many times, we use this example of an onion, sort of peeling off the different layers, and each layer creates like another spout of tears, and fears and so forth, because with increasing awareness and increasing ability to witness all of this, we are also becoming, more aware of our own, and arbitrarily, I just want to call them flaws right now, okay, inadequacies or things like this. So at the end of the day, we have to face the very part in us that we despise or reject or hate the most. We have to literally learn how to overcome the fear of our own inadequacy, of our own, whatever it is that we cannot accept about us, not just in our personality or in our life, but about, for many of you here in this circle, it's also the the limitation of being human altogether. Cindy, I know you have had these experiences as well at some point of this healing journey with your inner darkness. This
yes,
is like literally experiencing being human as a punishment.
yeah.
Is that kind of like, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but
Oh, yeah,
is
there
that
was
something?
a part of me that just would rather be in the etheric. I did not want to be in my human body because of the limitations. And
Hmm.
you can't put a language to that really when you have no idea what that actually is. But I literally felt like I was watching my life in a movie a lot of the times, just like not connected to
Hmm.
my actual 3D living process. And
Right, and if
that
suicide is
was,
not an option, right, for whatever reason,
yeah,
either for
yes.
religious
I mean,
reasons
I had
or,
kids.
yeah, but if that's not an option, then we literally just sit there and wait till the time passes by, right, to kind of just survive our life. I mean, it's
Yes,
as funny as it
yes.
sounds, but we were
It
just like,
literally was watching it just kind of go by.
hmm,
I didn't feel like I was an actual participant in my own life,
hmm.
or very little.
And then oftentimes, also with the symptomatics, of that, namely, seeing all we see is suffering and pain and basically the dark side of life, just reconfirming itself over and over again, right? Constant repeat.
Yeah.
So, one drama after
Yes.
the other, one suffering after the other, inconceivable uh, uh, experience, like suffering really over and over. And this is the problem with that is that once we perceive it that way and we don't do anything actively, as you said, we don't become an active participant, we no longer feel that we have a choice. We no longer feel that we even could do anything about it. We fawn to this. We just like let life happen to us.
Yes.
And then, as this happens quite frequently, actually, we can observe this in some elderly people who are very bitter. You know, uh, really just see their life as a burden. They're just waiting to no longer having to be here. So when someone is in this state of seeing life like that, I want to shift the perspective here to the healer in us or the practitioner, someone who is maybe talking to someone in that place. I want you all to remember that no matter what the expressions are for this person, be it suicidal thoughts or be it destructive behavior, that at the core of darkness is the separation and the suffering as a consequence of that separation. So the suffering that the person experiences is real for that person. It is not necessarily true as in, no matter from what perspective you look at it, it's always true. That would be sort of the difference between real and true. Uh, but it is very real for the person. I also want to uh, take sort of a slight philosophical excursus here into the mythical or mystical, namely what such archetypes or such concepts as incarnate darkness, okay, such as Satan, devil, and whatever they're called in different um, kind of religious contexts, what those are. Those are basically the manifestations, or representations, if you will, of our own psyche. Okay, so we cannot obviously, we can. I mean, this is what we're trying here, but we cannot grasp it. We have no concept for, as humans, with our mental, intellectual brain, for the absence of something. We have to think in dualistic or binary terms. So the simple mind, okay, the not so sophisticated mind, and also uh, the, the the mind that has no ability to connect with something like a higher inner perception, consciousness, will have to personify this. Will have to find uh, some symbolizations, symbols, archetypes that it can work with. So this is basically what the unconscious person does. Okay, the unconscious person sees the world as a dualistic, as a binary place, namely, either dark or light, either good or bad, either heaven or hell. You either believe in God, and if you don't believe in God, then you believe in Satan. I mean, that's sort of the binary aspect of that. Is that if it's not God, well, then it must be the devil. And I want to just have a sort of bit of a free flow here with you about this, how you were raised, what your views were, what your symbolism was. I mean, not all of you have had religious conditioning. Some of you, had none, or just sort of scientific framing of things. But what was that like for you? If you go back to very early memories of, of your own psyche, okay, when you first sort of started to think in terms of good or bad, dark or light, evil, good guys or bad guys, basically. Can you guys recall sort of the very beginnings of your own understanding of how the world works? Those of us who have kids could relive this with the kids, because they right around the age of 5 or 6, they start developing, they have questions about that. They start developing sort of their own philosophy about this.
Yeah, I can recall rejection and the better or worse, and um, just kind of like opting out and going into my own world in nature, being very
Okay,
creative. Yeah, so but yeah, I recall that.
so
And
you recall the experience of it, which is the rejection. You experienced the
yeah,
emotions of it. What was your first way of kind of framing this in the world, like good or bad? Like, okay, so rejection was the no for you. That was the biggest fear. Okay, so when you're in that place, that is like, there's like hell. Or what were these symbols or these representations that you worked with? I mean, you just said something about nature, and nature was kind of like the antidote for you, right? That was kind of good, the good guys.
yeah, and I believed in God. I mean, I
Very
remember
well. Okay.
hearing something that maybe not believing in figures, like even Jesus
Mm-hmm.
itself, but like the Holy Spirit was something too. And I heard this when I was like 4, 3, I don't know, like I was really young, and it came from my mom, right? Like, okay, you can laugh at everything, but honor the Holy Spirit, right? Like even the figure of Jesus itself, it was okay to like, be neutral about it or like whatever. So, and even I remember, I don't know, like it was very religious in a way, but also, um, yeah. And then I believed like women had to clean and stuff, and there were more like, less freedom for a woman, but more freedom for a man. So since
So
I was
that's
really early,
that's the experience of injustice. So you're talking about your experiences, but how
yeah,
did you frame that? How did you see this? How did you see the world divided into two places, or two forces, or two, like, good or bad?
yeah,
How did this
yeah.
form in you? Like, what were the symbols of that?
Well, bad was the devil. Good
Okay.
was, yeah, God, right? So, um, and
What did
yeah,
you see? How did you understand the devil as a child? How did it
like
come to people?
shadow dark, like, um, so it was an immediate like rejection from my end, like didn't like the Bible someone or something, I'd be like, no, devil, like, um, so I guess, I don't know if this helps. Yeah. So I guess there was an unconscious judgment of like yes and no, right? Like, um, yeah.
So what I'm modeling to you guys here right now is how you can help a person to become more aware of what it actually is that they regard as light and dark. Okay. So Denise, you shared your experience of darkness, okay, which was when you felt rejected, or when you, at least those are the examples, or when you felt injustice, right? That felt really, really, I mean, bad for you. How did, I'm using words such as good and bad right now, because that's really how we experienced it at the time. Can you recall emotional things along with it? Did it cause
Yeah.
anger in
I
you,
felt
or
I felt very I was always very angry, and I would push people away with my anger when I wanted to. I knew how to do that. So another very distinctive feeling was I felt like I was an alien, like not belonging, like this, the
okay.
world around me didn't like it, it was just a big joke because it was so alien. I couldn't connect. Like I felt like I couldn't connect, like on the bigger scale.
So what you just found out, Denise, is like your early framework, and that was that due to the disconnection or the rejection, the negative feeling that was caused, okay, created anger in you, and you equaled that with darkness, you equaled that with devil.
Yeah.
So now as a grown up, and you've worked through, a lot of these inner child things and so forth, so you're more aware of this, right? You can imagine what this can do to a person, right? If there's a framework that says, so whenever I feel angry, that's devilish, that's a temptation of the devil or something, and you get treated that way, right? Right? I mean, you see the confirmation here, right? And they may even, if there is a strong religious context, they may even say it, right? I mean, there's people who are raised like with even words such as devilish child or spawn of the devil or something like that when you show anger. All right. So what do you, from everything that you already know in your wisdom now as a grown up, as an adult, know what this has created in you? Will we be very inclined? Will we be, will we develop a free relationship and connection with our own anger? If somebody tells us that when we're angry, that's like being possessed by the devil.
No, it has taken me 40 years to get to the place where I'm accepting my
Yeah,
anger, like
yeah,
literally, like, and
exactly.
it's funny because this morning I woke up and I'm like, I had this flashback of children throwing tantrums because I work with children, right?
Uh-huh.
And I was like, that is not the worst thing. Actually, that's a lot better than guilt, or that, you know what I mean? Like the awareness came and I let it go. But yeah, 40 years working with accepting my own or allowing myself to express it. Yeah.
So you have learned now, with all the wisdom and all the knowledge and the knowing that you have, that anger is actually a rather healthy, well, all emotions are healthy, but it's actually, compared to, like, say, shame and damnation and guilt, it's actually a much more promising state, right?
And
If
I
one
actually
can
feel
express
blessed.
it.
I feel blessed, if a child is throwing a tantrum in the sense that I don't have to deal with the lower, you know what I mean? It's just helping them reframe and helping them feel and helping them like realize what their need is, So I don't know.
Right. So
Yeah.
this is now, your experience and your intellectual understanding. You understand that when there is anger, that there is always some kind of unmet need there, and that anger itself is neither light or dark, right? It's not devilish or anything, good. It's just a sign. It's just a signal. It's a sign that there is something in the person that is either that is feeling violated, or that is that feels like it's been treated unjustly, or that there's something that it needs, he or she, and cannot express it right or cannot get it. All right. So anger in and of itself is not good or bad. Anger is simply a state that a person can experience when something is imbalanced. But if we have been conditioned or programmed with concepts, all right, that put this good or bad, or heaven or hell, or a god or devil, to some of our natural responses and signals, then that can literally lead to a person cutting out entire parts of their own range of feelings, right? I mean, since this was done to you, not with the malintent or anything, just as part of sort of a religious context, Denise.
Mhm.
You just said it took you 40 years to accept anger as just really a normal part of your emotional range, and that it's more like that's why you said the reframing, that it's more like a sign that there's an unmet need or something behind that, and that it's actually healthier than guilt, right? This is now the smart you, right? That says,
Yeah.
it's much better to feel that way than that way, because when you were younger, this occurrence of experiencing your own anger made you afraid of your own darkness, and as a consequence of suppressing it, then, because nobody wants to be dark,
Yeah, I felt
especially.
like I was bad, like I was
Exactly.
like something was wrong with me, or like it would directly be linked to guilt, feeling like bad about
Mhm.
myself, like
Right, and that's then ultimately the same thing, right? Because I
yeah.
mean, feeling bad about ourselves and feeling there's something wrong with us, that's very close to damnation. I mean, damnation is something that occurs in us if we have an externalized framework with it, namely that there's either somebody sitting in the clouds and judging us, or some kind of authoritarian figure in our life, or some kind of like outside authority that tells us what's good or bad, right? And if we are in that state of guilt, we're already basically afraid of being found out, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's like, oh shit, I'm dark. And the only thing that can happen to me now is that somebody says, I see your darkness, and no, I damn you for it, or I punish you for it. Okay. This is the crux with the framework. You have now, as a grown up, a different framework, which is anger is healthier than guilt. So I might as well deal with anger, but be it my own or be it other people's angers, especially in conjunction, of course, with being an educator and everything, working with children. You can now see how important it is to not judge anger, and to help children to develop a way to deal with their anger that transcends it or transforms it into something constructive rather than guilt, right?
Yeah, by showing them, it helps them reconnect with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
If it
Yeah,
makes
because
any sense, right?
especially
So
young
like,
children.
yeah.
Yeah, because at that moment, as we already know, the subjective experience of darkness can always be led back to a lack of connection. And whether that leads then to an unmet need, or to an experience of rejection, or having been kicked out of the tribe, those are all the variations of this, like, sort of really, really, really dark place, where we feel alone, helpless, powerless, and often also guilty. And so, as healers and self-healers, we understand that. We have the compassion for that as well, and so we help other people to get past their own judgment. So this is one of the things that I want you to take a mental note of here as a healer, that no matter what healing modality, whether it's body work, whether it's therapy, counseling, any, medicine, energy work, doesn't matter, whatever the modality is, it's always about connection, and it's always about helping the person to reconnect with their inner feelings, because there is the core of the imbalance. Okay, the disconnection with ourselves creates imbalances, all the way to like a skewed sense of normality, or like hostile perceptions of the world and oneself, which can then lead to attack or self-attack, right? So at the core, this is the very first thing that you can already filter here from a self-mastery class, at the core is to identify what these emotions or states in which we experience certain emotions. For many, it's anger, all right, that we reject the most about ourselves, that we are most afraid of. Because if you can identify this with yourself or with a patient or client, then you already have a roadmap right there. Then the main part of the healing strategy must include to work with those states and those emotions that the person, him or herself, rejects the most. Or in other words, what they're, what they can not accept or love about themselves, what they experience as a flaw, what they experience as dark. So it's never about whether or not is quote unquote objectively dark. It's always about how the person perceives darkness and how he or she associates it with what kind of emotions it's associated with for the person. Okay, so Denise, in your case, anger is an early childhood conditioning from you, is a devilish thing. That's not acceptable. That's when you're angry, then that's bad. Then you are bad. You're a bad girl when you're angry. Okay, and that's the core of your healing process. Okay, is to overcome this resistance or the fear thereof of this particular state, of this particular emotion, namely anger. That's not the same for everyone. And let's look here at the other sharings, but for women, it's quite common. For women in our day and age, it's quite common because there's also collective conditionings and social expressions that are accepted in societies and that are not accepted based on gender. So in our Western societies, the expression of anger in women is not accepted. We'll get to archetypes a little later, but for men, it is way more socially accepted to express anger. It's kind of like the only expression that males are really allowed to do in public. Most other expressions, such as sadness or fear, for males are not accepted for them because that would equal a certain type of weakness, unmanliness, and therefore men often have bigger issues with states such as fear or pain. All right, I just wanted to remind you all that it's not the same for everyone, and that there can also be gender-specific things. And Becky, you were sharing that you were programmed. We're still talking about the symbolism and how our early framework for darkness forms. You were programmed, and you also saw the world basically divided into angels and demons. Christian oriented, but with the undertone of God was to be feared. So God, in the way that you grew up with, was a sort of like this outside authority, and it was to be feared, and one had to be good, or else one would go to hell or would not be let into heaven, right? That's kind of like sort of the what's it called, a brimstone, fire and brimstone variation on Christianity.
Yeah,
right? Is that sort of like you literally? I mean, you just brought it to the point. You had to be good, because if you
exactly.
weren't,
Or else you're separate, or
oh yes, you'll suffer. Oh, hell breaks loose, or you're like possessed. I
you're
mean, right?
kicked out. Like, yeah.
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 So you basically turned from an angel into a demon. So the world really was only divided into these two types. right? The angels, symbolically, sort of the people who are good, who are following, sort of God's word or whatever it's been called, to the best of their abilities, right? And then there's the temptations. The temptations come from the devil, right? So anything that is not good according to God is leads to suffering. So it's basically a very simplified binary way of looking at the world with an externalized authority. So there always is this sort of God is watching over you. He can see all your stuff,
Yes.
right? And you
Oh my
better
gosh.
be good.
Yes. And he's scary, and he's a he, and so you'll feel shame. There's lots to feel shame about if you're not good. So yeah.
So these early representations or symbolizations of good and bad, if no matter how much we intellectually grow out of this, you will see that there is a part in you that still operates on that level. It's the power of conditioning, all right? To see the world divided into angels and demons, or to have this fear of when I'm not good, then I must be bad, right? That's the logic, right? It means that there's no room for error, no room. And as soon as I discover a flaw, that means I'm a bit closer to hell, right? I'm not
Exactly.
perfect.
I'm further away from
Yeah.
God and closer to hell.
Yeah. So I have to be perfect, because if I'm not perfect, then I'm basically doomed to go to hell. So for all of you here who have conscious or unconscious performance issues, right? This is a way to decode this in you. Okay, there's an externalized authority, and it's very binary. It's not very sophisticated. It's like literally either or. There's no really no redemption possible, unless, and that's then depending on what kind of religious context you were conditioned with, you do certain things. Okay, so certain types of atonement. Back in the days in the Middle Ages, with paying a lot of money to the church, and then you were fine, right? You could buy your way out of your judgment. You could basically bribe the judge, right? Then it was more about, in sort of later developments, it was more about maybe spreading the word of God, or like good doing, okay, that came into the foreground. And the variation that we are living here now in the 21st century is overall collectively, even though we obviously still have all these different religious directions that work within a very externalized and wrathful God, punitive God. But the overall tendency right now is to actually loosen up that framework into a more internalized version of God, into a more sort of God being, acting through me, okay, and sort of opening this up a little bit. I do want to point out, though, that most of these value systems that we have, and with it often also the moral compass that we have that forms in this very early stage, that's not very sophisticated. So a punitive God, okay, like a God that is wrathful and punishing, and really it isn't based on truth. Okay, this is not, this has nothing to do with, me propagating any particular religion or version of God. Is not the point. The point is that if something, here's the logic, if something is the creation of life, and the creation in all its duality, okay, in all its expressions, how can it punish or basically send a cease and desist note to anything that is a lower expression, if it is part of its own creation. This would basically negate its own creation. So the negation of creation is not part of creation. On the contrary, the evolution of creation, the consistently evolving, consistently and continually growing and improving and adapting, is what creation propagates. That's what's life expanding. That's what's, what helps, what supports and nourishes life and creation. So it can be, in a very theoretical way, right now I'm trying to be extremely neutral here, it can be assumed or concluded actually that whatever the intelligence or entity or power behind creation is, that it would represent everything that is life promoting, that is, increasing life, if you will, that is helping to expand life and not to destroy it. And with that, then, as we've talked about the absence of light and the darkness really being the absence of light, we can conclude, this is quite normal in our linear psyche, that we develop some kind of anti-God or anti-creation, right? So that would be consistent with the way our neurological system is designed, that we have some kind of framework or symbolism or archetype in us that symbolizes life, and with it also light and expansion and growth and thriving and evolution, but also the opposite, the absence of that, and then the absence of life and thriving and beauty and expansion then turns into contraction, into life degrading, life restricting, and perhaps even destructive, life destroying. So I want you, as we are further progressing here, through our deeper understanding of darkness in a person as a healer or self-healer, and helping a person to come up with new roadmap, new value systems, and a framework or strategy for healing, I would like to ask you to see darkness as sort of anti-life. Okay, can we agree on that?
Yes, yes.
Is that something that makes sense to all of you, regardless of what religious background or whatever the conditioning is that you have? That if we look at basically light as life and darkness as the anti force, okay, so the against life, right, in all its variations, like from little to big, from like just being contractive all the way to destructive. So if we begin to reframe this for us that way, then of course some of the experiences that you shared earlier, they then can be seen from a different perspective. And here's a few questions. Cindy, I got all your texts. Yes, the fear of making mistakes and so forth, belonging. And those are all fundamental psychological things. So the fear of not belonging, the fear of not being part of the heaven group, right, of the angel, of the angel group, of the light. The fear of not belonging to the good guys, all right, ultimately is the fear of not standing in light, not being connected to life. And it plays directly into our fear of cease and desist, into our mortality. And here you guys see the problem with darkness. Darkness defined as the absence of light, the absence of life, therefore then becomes equal with our fear of dying. So it is therefore understandable that when we run into our own inner darkness, that not only that we first run into this not very sophisticated framework of good and bad, all or nothing, but also that we respond to it with a fear of death, with a direct threat to our life, because it is. Yes, which is the same as the fear of living without connection, is the fear of being disconnected from light, from life. Okay, that's really it. And Cindy, you shared this earlier when you said, you were living your life, but kind of like you weren't really part of it. It was just happening. It wasn't part, you weren't really connected to it. Now, this is a wonderful example for how darkness can creep in. And it sheds a whole different light here, a whole different perspective onto what darkness is.
Jona, I noticed throughout the years that, now in my present life, with all the training and everything, I fear more being disconnected from myself than being disconnected from the world, because if I'm connected to myself, then I can easily connect with the world. So this is one of the shifts that I have noticed, from seeking connection outside, now making it more of a habit connecting within.
And you now also realize that there's a direct connection. So if you cannot connect within, then it's a lot harder to connect without. So the opposite of that. So this is very important here. This happens in the healing process when the person begins to actually experience the connection to light or life. So light and life here in this context is really the same. Okay. And then you begin to, your perception begins to become more rarefied, and you begin to feel consciously how often you're actually not connected. And that's a typical sort of ascension problem. Okay. There's a typical problem that happens to people when they actually begin to heal, is that they become more aware of when they are not connected. They become more consciously aware of this, and of course experience the pain of that very consciously as well. But compared to the state that Cindy described so beautifully earlier, where you just feel completely disconnected and you don't have a choice, where you feel completely powerless and without any control over this, the onset of that, when you realize that you're not connected with yourself, okay, is a major step in a person's self-healing process. Because now this person begins to form a new navigation, a new roadmap. Okay, you now at least know what to aim for. Here in this picture, it's kind of, that's why I picked the picture. It's, you're now seeing, oh, there's a light there at the end of the tunnel. I'm not quite there, but at least I know where to go. Right? As opposed to being caught in this completely dark place where you can't see any light. So what I mean to say with this, Denise, in response to what you just said, is that this happens to a person when they're in the midst of this transformation and healing process. And this can still be somewhat experienced as suffering, because you're now becoming more aware of when you're not connected. But I want to point out that in order to feel that you're not connected, you must have some kind of reference for what it feels like when you're connected. And that's, as a healer and self-healer, what you need to focus on, what you need to prioritize. So when you personally or your client or patient describes such a state to you, how often they feel disconnected, then this is an indication for you that this person actually has a reference for when they're connected, and that's awesome. That means they're not in the dark night of their soul. When somebody's in the dark night of their soul, they no longer can recall what it feels like to be connected. And in that healing process, all this person needs really is encouragement, and sometimes like an assisting or guiding hand, just someone who confirms it for them and who basically just tells them, follow the light, go to what makes you feel connected, focus on that connection, and then all the other stuff, the suffering, the continued experience of recurring pain begins to dissipate, begins to resolve itself. Now, Cindy is asking an interesting question here. How does one approach this with or coach someone who is an atheist? It's very easy, Cindy, because we're not actually working with religious terms. So this example here, how I broke this down for you, darkness and light as sort of archetypal experience of our psyche, being connected with life force or light itself, and feeling disconnected is something that everybody can feel, regardless of the mental framework or the mindset or the belief system behind it. Atheism is a mindset, okay? It's a belief system that assumes that there is no higher power, right? There is no higher power. And this can be debated, obviously, but it's not important really in the healing process. The only thing that is important is now, okay, so let's just take that. We do, though, experience the presence of our own existence, right? We do exist, right? I'm alive, right? So even an atheist or someone who doesn't believe in higher power has to admit to that. Okay, so that's not just a reality, that's the truth. So see, the one truth that we all, at least if we're not mentally ill, some mental illnesses that is being questioned if we actually really exist. And of course, sort of the expanded energetic and etheric view puts a different spin on it. But like say the 3D physical incarnation here cannot be debated. Okay, so when you talk to someone who calls themselves an atheist with the mindset of higher power does not exist, then you have to agree first on the most common denominator, and that would be the simple fact that this person exists. Okay, so even the most convinced nihilists cannot deny the existence of themselves. Okay, can you follow me here, Cindy? It has nothing to do with their belief system of how, and you don't have to go there with a person, you don't have to convince them what made them become exist. It's not the point, right? Atheists like to get into that debate, but it's not important for the healing process. For the healing process, it's only important to agree on the very existence of the person, him or herself, and that then is being taken as the benchmark. Okay, all right, you exist. Okay, therefore you are. Okay, and now anything that goes against you is existing is obviously something that is perceived as suffering or darkness, and everything that promotes or nurtures or helps you, supports you to exist is perceived as positive. I mean, you can agree to positive or negative with anybody, no matter what their belief system is. Okay, if you bring it to the most simple level of existence itself. And I think, Denise, you mentioned this earlier. that you have experienced darkness, when I asked about your personal experiences of darkness, where that can also become a question: do I even exist? Yeah. And this is when someone actually, it's an indication when someone is no longer convinced that life is true. And that's when suicide becomes almost like a logical consequence. Okay, because if I don't exist anymore anyway, then what's the point? Yeah. At that stage, no matter what the person's belief system is, the only thing that can help a person out of the state actually is a spiritual context. And oftentimes this can no longer be done through words or concepts per se. It has to come through the person's own experience, and that it has to go through stages. So when we have to coach somebody out of a suicidal state, this is a separate self-mastery class. We have to first and foremost address this physically, on a physical level, because there's also a neurological condition that makes this even more difficult to emotionally, mentally overcome. So we have to work physically first, basically help the person to change the neurotransmitter and structure, and get the life juices flowing again, so that the person can subjectively experience life force. Okay, and at that moment when the person begins to experience life force again, we can help the person, and this is why energy work is a very instrumental or a very effective tool for those really deep dark states. We can help the person with energy work to actually see the light, and that would then in psychology be called a spiritual context. As energy workers, we see this a little more differentiated, because spiritual as energy worker is still a belief system. Okay, we have to always investigate the belief system of a person before we can work with a person on a spiritual level. But when we work with someone on a pure energetic level, that is not needed, because we are not infusing the person with any particular symbolism other than sort of universal symbolism for energies, and that can be perceived the way the person wants to perceive it and with the symbolism that they have. So if they see the world as angels and demons, and we expose a person who's in a very dark place with a very, very high vibratory energy, say grace, for instance, then they may see it as angels, right? If they have a very strong, if they have a religious context, they may see it as Jesus, or some more sophisticated symbolisms, still Christian symbolisms, but a little more universal, like say a white dove or a white rose. And someone who does not is not bound or has already transcended religious programming might see lights, might see geometrical shapes or colors and so forth. Yes, Annette, you're making a really important point here. Many people, you say here in Denmark, but that is not just in Denmark, that is a typical sort of Western world problem, take medicine in those situations. Yes, medicine is a physical manipulation. It's a physical manipulation of the energy structure of a person's body. And this would fall into the same category that I just mentioned. When somebody's in that dark place, the often is, one has to act quite hasty, because you never know if they actually have the experience of if they actually follow through with suicide. So that's why the state is often medicated. This would be the same as some other things that I just mentioned, like to get the juices flowing. It's obviously more holistic to help a person to get out of the state without any external manipulation, without pills or medication, because then the person can better reproduce this and can own this and feels more adequate should this ever happen again. But you are right, physical manipulation in form of prescription drugs is the most common treatment for suicide. But it is not often the most effective treatment, only because, and this is a big problem, and the pharmaceutical industry and even psychiatry will not easily admit that. What happens is if you get a person out of that suicidal state, okay, let's go back to the energy here. You get the person out of the suicidal state, out of this very low state, maybe into a slightly higher energetic state. It is very common that the person then actually perceives the enough energy to follow through with the suicide. So if somebody is actually caught in this extremely dark place, they typically also don't even have the energy to kill themselves. But as soon as their energy is manipulated through, say, meds, and I don't want you guys to see this as like always, okay? I said it's common, but it's not always the case. That's why, someone in this state needs to be, and therapy needs to be observed, okay? But it is possible that it can backfire if the person cannot own this themselves, if they cannot be part of it, if it's just the meds doing it, all right, then the slight elevation in energy can then lead to an actual follow through with, an acting out of suicidal thoughts. So we need to be very careful there, and obviously, depending on what kind of healer you are, what kind of training and licensing you have, certain things can be done and cannot be done, and also need to be seen with caution and always in conjunction with your license and what you're even allowed to recommend. With energy work, we do not run into any danger here because we are not actually manipulating a person from the outside. This is also the reason why energy healing is not regulated, because there is no physical manipulation that is taking place. Okay, so as of right now, in our Western world, the licensing of healing professions is basically regulated legally, and also as far as like treatment plans and so forth is concerned, based on the level of physical manipulation that is taking place. Okay, I'm reading your comments. Yeah. Cindy, would you like to, I don't know if it's Cindy or Denise here because you're using both the same name. What touched you deeply just right now? What brought you to tears just right now?
When you were just talking about how to help a person who is that low, just connect with themselves and go through the process. It just,
Yes.
for some reason, it just touched me very deep, brought me to tears. It was very beautiful. Thank you.
So as a healer of whatever profession or a license or whatever modality you use, when somebody is in that really this suicidal kind of state that we are describing, where there's a total disconnection and total absence of light/life, all right, the most effective healing that this person can experience at this very moment is actually the exposure to light. Okay, literally seeing a light at the end, literally seeing it. And how can this be accomplished? Suicide prevention is very clear on this. It's very simple, really, through human connection. A simple being present for somebody, listening to somebody, paying attention to somebody, It seems almost nothing, but it is in that state of emptiness, right? The compassion and the love of someone who is just present, listens or holds a hand, be it physically. Obviously, it's a bit more effective when you do this in person, through the phone, or etherically, is what can pull a person out of that state. It's the confrontation or the exposure to a higher vibratory field, and that can trigger the memory, the recall of the person, for the person in themselves. Yes, it's the remembrance, because we all have a remembrance. Remembrance is not the same as memory. Memory is a cognitive function. Remembrance is more like a feeling, like an overall, it's a holistic experience. Exactly, Annette, that is hope. That is experienced as hope. It is really simple hope. It is not yet courage or, like the power to make changes, but it is hope. The person might still be pessimistic, but it does show them a light. Okay, it's something that is sort of subjectively experienced as it's worth it. It's worth it. This is something that healers like myself, I'm specialized on the dark night of the soul. That is really, what I'm good at. Okay, we need to understand, that it ultimately, when that darkness can weave through any state and through any part of the person's energy system, and at some point of the healing process, or at the beginning point, let me rephrase this, of the healing process, always needs to be the connection with the person, a genuine, truthful connection. We call this a heart connection or empathy, not sympathy. Here again, big distinction between sympathizing with somebody and empathetically, unconditionally being present. Two big, huge differences energetically. Sympathizing with the person actually creates a resonance and typically increases, energizes the condition that a person is in. Yeah, I'm reading your comment here. All right, so let's go back to the theoretical part, and even sort of work with the terminology here a little bit and investigate different kinds of shadow and what the shadow actually is. So we've spent now 2.5 hours on with the first part included on defining what darkness is, and I think we all have a pretty good feel for um, how to approach this and how to see this, okay, in a person, in ourselves. And now let's move on to shadow. So how does shadow play into this? What is shadow? Shadow really is a psychological term, mostly researched by Freud and Carl Jung, so like about 100 years ago. So Jungian psychology is, I would say, in psychological sort of textbook culture, the first to go place, for anything in regards to shadow. And then we'll see that shadow, obviously, it also goes into the mythological and archetypal definition of good and bad and so forth. That's like reaches all the way back to the Greek philosophers, so this is a part of our human condition and has always been part of philosophical and scientific investigation. All right, but Carl Jung is really the one who investigated particularly the shadow parts, and not just the overall darkness and lightness, but what actually happens here and how does this tie in with our psychology. And I want to give you 3 arbitrary versions of shadow. Arbitrary because they're not psychological definitions, those are words or terms that I use. There's first the normal quote unquote ego shadow trait. Okay, this is everything that really, as a consequence of of being caught here in our own perception of darkness. All right, we develop sort of these coping mechanisms. Those can be anything from behavioral things to belief systems to emotional and mental and even physical symptoms or patterns. Okay, coping patterns. So anything in us that we've developed in the course of our life that helps us to deal with darkness or with, as we know, we defined it as inner disconnection. Okay, and into this category falls literally all survival and all control patterns that we have. Okay, this is all of them. Anything, even the animalistic dog eats dog and greed and there's, you know, some religions contextualize this as the seven deadly sins, but you know, if you just look at the human nature, you'll find that those are all instinctual, pre-programmed behavior patterns regulated through the not sophisticated parts of our nervous system, the amygdala and the reptilian parts of the brain stem, so the least developed parts of our neurological system, which is also why they are often accompanied through these hardwired reactions, fight, flight, or freeze. All right. So anything that falls into this category can be regarded as a part of our ego shadow. Okay, this is what our ego makes us do, and it is not fully in our control. And for the most part, as most of you have now understood, when we are in our ego perception, it is not always to really the benefit of life or life force or light. You know, it is more or less just to stay alive wherever we're at. It's more like a maintenance or the priorities of maintenance of like staying, you know, holding where we're at to not make it worse. Okay, and this then also includes the more sophisticated control mechanisms and behaviors that we develop in the course of our lives. You know, like anything that we do in order to quote unquote get a grip on things. This can include our trauma responses. This can include sort of this excessive self-doubting, critical inner voice. Those are all parts of our coping mechanism, such as well as our childhood attachments, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment. Those are all linked to actual memories, conscious or unconscious, things that have happened to us. But also, you know, a more generalized fear of loss or fear of rejection, fear of insignificance. Um, the, in this category also falls emotional manipulation, mostly the unconscious kind of emotional manipulation. Most of the emotional manipulation that we are doing or, you know, that we have in our life is conditioned. You know, this is what it was done to us. So for instance, if we have been raised with guilt tripping and so forth, it's very likely that we use forms of that in our adult life. Okay, as because that's we were taught those tools. All right, and of course, you know, it has in its core and also in its expression the fear of judgment and punishment. We've talked about this also as part of the conditioning, and many of us in various degrees also need to cope with our fear of darkness, which in a more neutral translation is really the fear of the unknown. Okay, so it's linked to our mortality. Okay, we don't know how long we live. We don't know, you know, we don't know. We really don't know. We don't know anything. But for a psyche, that's a very difficult state, and so it has to cope with it. It has to develop things, okay, that make it feel a bit more in control, that it can, anticipate things, that it can plan things, that it can, feel like you kind of know what's going to happen tomorrow. Okay, so this is where our normal, where our ego coping behaviors come from. It's our own psyche's attempt, all right, to deal with all the uncertainties and unknowns, and all the different conditions and expressions of our own existence. Then we also have expressions of shadow that have to do with our perception, and that can be something that this is a like subject of consciousness science. Like why, how come, that some people who were born into this world perceive the world in this way right off the bat. Even taking out the conditioning. All right, how come people are just generally optimistic and some people are generally pessimistic? Okay, so this has to do with the development of self. Okay, the identifications. All right, the transpersonal stuff, and also the narratives. Okay, either the narratives that we tell ourselves, the story, our story, or that was told to us. All right, but it can also occur as a consequence of simply a lack of discernment, in stronger disconnection right off the bat. So Hawkins, for instance, Dr. Hawkins calls this the level of consciousness. So there is something in us that is already sort of predetermined or predisposed, that kind of plays into our ability to develop discernment. Okay, it predisposed the perception of things. So most of it is sociological, most of it is conditioned, but not all of it. Okay, there's a limitation that some people have as far as their perception is concerned. This is not always circumstantial or sociological. Okay, this can also come from a consciousness level that was basically chosen as as sort of a karmic experience, and therefore karma can be part of our shadow aspects. It's the unseen and the inherited ties, keyword, family karma for existence, where things get inherited from one generation to the next, and they are sort of there as sort of predisposed condition. Can you guys all follow me so far? I'm zooming through this only because these are things that are part of the sacred self-healing and all self-healing sort of self-transformation subjects. So I don't want to really spend more time on this. I much rather want to investigate some of the more complex aspects of or complex shadow traits, and that would be the dark shadow and the white shadow. So these are the second and the third kind of shadowiness. All right, there still are distinctive differences. All right, between just sort of ego, right? Being egoistic, and being dark, right? I mean, there's. Can you guys all feel the difference? I mean, this is a feeling. Okay, can you feel the difference between someone just being like really egotistical, and someone being malicious or destructive? So we have a sense for that. Yeah. Okay, I see some of you do. And Cindy, you want to share something? Since you're the most talkative today. Okay.
No, I just love how once you can zoom out and just sort of experience and learn about all of this, how they all tie together.
Yes.
Just like what we've been doing with the trauma, the inner child, the shadow work. It's
all connected.
It all weaves together. It's so cool.
So dark shadow, and I'm like I said, those are arbitrary terms. Could cover these realms. These are realms. These are scales. Okay, there's if you will, a scale of 0 to 10 for all of them. So not this is not an absolute state or behavior trait. It's more like a feeling. Okay, so there's a destructive maliciousness, which I think all people would agree is something that feels evil. All right, it's just like destruction for the sake of destruction. Yeah, if that makes sense. We have destructive behaviors or self-destructive behaviors that are also shadow traits, but they're not always sort of destructive for the sake of destruction. They're more sort of like a helplessness or sort of a lashing out. So there are different levels of that, and destructive maliciousness is one of the traits of dark shadow. There's also a an expression that we can observe through an sort of excessive, okay, so I'm talking extremes here, grandiosity or superiority. Yeah, when somebody sees themselves like literally standing above all life, above all others, above humans. Okay, this can often be seen in cult leaders or tyrants or dictators. Okay, there is a disconnection on a much different scale, and that is that every other living being is basically subhuman. It's is below them. Okay, it's not the same as a messiah complex. A messiah complex is a mental illness, and that can come more out of white shadow traits. I'll get to that here in a second. So there's more. There's this dark shadow is like literally the illusion of power over creation itself. Okay, I am God, and I decide who lives and who dies. It's this, seeing oneself as creation itself, and sometimes even above creation itself. Then we have a different expressions here in exploitative or parasitic type of behaviors. Okay, where it is totally okay for a person to completely suck other people dry, or countries dry, or genocide, or to exploit all the resources, or to like for the support of one's own life, to destroy another life. Yeah, it's a little less evil, but it is still is an expression of dark shadow, obviously, because it's not life promoting. All attitudes and behaviors that have this life degrading and sort of hateful attitude towards life itself, all right, could be defined as dark shadow, and with it also, of course, done sort of slightly less obvious, but quite dark behavior patterns and expressions of selfishness and possessiveness. All right. And then probably the least but most common form of dark shadow in people is manipulative and strategically manipulative. So we all have this sort of unconscious manipulation that we were conditioned with. That's quite common, but there's a sort of a strategic manipulation. All right, the one quite common expression of that is the one in narcissism, in narcissistic personality disorders. And there are mental illnesses that are associated with these states, and this is also part of the problem in clinical psychology today, that the confrontation with darkness and seeing darkness and hearing dark voices and experiencing dark energies is not fully resolved for psychology and psychiatry yet, because in this classification, the way that psychology does it, the expression of any of these dark shadow traits, you know, is categorized as psychopathic or sociopathic, and this is not enough really to capture this, because first of all, not everyone who sees this or experiences this is mentally ill. All right, we know this here as energy workers, that it is quite possible for a completely sane person, even for a person is very connected with light, to see darkness, to hear it, to experience it. Okay, so we have to be, as holistic healers, a bit more uh, verified here in our definition of darkness, but also cautious at the same time, because the pure absence of light in a person, yes, often, more often than not, leads to severe mental illnesses. So I would say, in the way I see this, as the other way around. If a person is chronically, you know, over a prolonged amount of time, completely disconnected from life force, from light, then the psyche has to develop illnesses, pathologies to survive. Okay. So for me, a psychopath or a sociopath is someone who has experienced evilness or darkness and had limited tools to process that, and basically became insane of it, and then within its expression of you know, the pathologies of that, you know, being psychopathic, sociopathic, you know, mass shootings or serial killing and stuff like that.
Jona,
Mm-hmm.
are people that, you know, I mean, whoever tends to go to that stream of darkness, are they born with that tendency? Are they born like that, or is it life that, you know, the experiences that?
This is a question that I cannot obviously fully answer, because I don't have the capacity. You know, it's above my pay grade. But I can share my observations with you. I clearly, I do agree with Dr. Hawkins' view that there is a predestined sort of level of consciousness that a person is born with, and some people are born with a very low conscious level, which typically translates into psychopathic developments, yeah, pathologies of that. And one could say, I mean, if one had a sort of a medieval mindset, one could say that these persons were born evil. Okay. But the etheric perspective, the energetic perspective of this is a bit different. It's like when a person is born into darkness, okay, into this utter disconnect. All right, then first of all, it's a deficiency here. There is a deficiency of light. The person has never really experienced the presence of light, and is therefore, of course, in his or her perception, limited. Okay, that's one thing. And this can also have to do with the environment that we are born into. So if people are being born into an environment that is very limited there in this perception, then it can propagate that. And the studies have shown that if you take people out of their environments and give them the experience, you know, expose them to light, to higher vibratory things, that they are transcending their darkness. Okay. There are, however, and I want to be honest with you guys here, expressions of evilness that are beyond just sort of, say, mental illness or pathology or psychopathy. But in those cases, we would probably rather speak of a possession. Okay, so it is possible that a dark energy, a dark entity, can, if the energy of a person is low enough to not withstand this. Okay, so the suicide is one of those, you know, suicidal states is one of those states, or people who are etherically very fragmented, people who smoke a lot of pot, people who take a lot of drugs, they're extremely susceptible to possession because they're no longer inhabiting their own etheric, okay? And they can easily be hijacked, kidnapped energetically. And in those states, you know, when there's like very, very little life force left in a person, you know, when sort of the soul identity is almost gone, a person can, you know, a person's body and psyche can be taken over by really dark energies who do exist. They're rare in their expression, but they do exist. Okay, so those are entities or manifestations of this utter disconnection. Okay, you know, dense. They're very dense energies, dense fields. Okay, that basically have the purpose of working against light, if you will, or it's not actually against light. It's like they're sucking light out. They're sucking the living light out of people. Okay, that's a more sophisticated way of seeing it. Okay, so these archetypal mythological representations and archetypes, such as devil and Satan, that's the context that our subconscious creates because it was conditioned with those terms. But if you actually look at it just from a pure energetic point of view, what you're seeing is a transfer of light, a transfer of life force. And that's a matter of energetic power in that field, density. Okay, so a very, very dense, dark field, we would call this dark, so dense as in like absence of light, all right, can overcome a person's own etheric shielding that we have through our, you know, soul awareness, if they're really low already. Okay, and then you're no longer dealing with the person. Then it's no longer the person. Did this answer your question? So it's not like the person isn't. It's not the evil. Okay, the person is acting on behalf of it. Okay. Now this can, of course, happen in various degrees and on different scales. Okay, so let's say the Christian contextualization, or like how most religions contextualize darkness, is not quite untrue because, you know, there are temptations. There are temptations of the ego. You know, remember, you know, those are normal ego traits here. Okay, you know, to wanting to get more of that, you know, so just so that oneself can feel better about oneself. You know, so the seven deadly sins, for example, they can be seen as temptations of the devil. It just is not very sophisticated to personify it and externalize it that way. It is much more complex, namely that it is indeed part of our own psyche. It is part of us. So to a degree, it means that we all have angels and demons in us. Okay, and this is you know, the way we often see this in energy work. Okay, so it is you know, basically like a continuum that is in a constant flow between light and the absence of light. Okay, and when something is filled up with light, you know, and fully, you know, conscious and also present moment awareness in light, okay, then the immune system that the person has, you know, towards say outer darkness or darkness that comes in through the fields of other people, affects them less. So the lower the more disconnected we are, the more we can also be affected by outer darkness. That's very important to understand because this is dynamic. It is not absolute. It's not absolute. And this is really what the whole sort of mythology is about, you know, like you know, saving a soul, turning a person, you know, from the, I mean, Star Wars is all about that, you know, how you know, intrinsically good person can be pulled into towards the dark side of the force, and how that is actually a choice, and how one can also redeem oneself by turning back to the light. So this is really what all religions are about. You know, the ultimate teachings, and what we can see as like truth teachings, really are about becoming aware of that choice, and then successively learning what is needed to turn to the light, and how we can cultivate this, and how or what we need to look at to avoid, you know, to getting pulled into the darker aspects of ourselves. And this leads me then here to the white shadow aspect that is also part of ourselves, which are the not so obvious darknesses in us that are covert, or also actually in some societies, in our society right now, it is as goodness. Okay, so they're like fake goodness, if you will, and fake goodness is darkness. Okay, so fake niceness. Okay, and especially the kind of fake niceness that always comes with a hook. Okay, that requires some kind of payoff. Okay, uh, is a variation of our own darkness. It's a white shadow trait, and therefore, you know, needs to be, if we want to really learn what enlightenment means, that if we want to really walk this path, we have to work with our white shadow aspects, you know, where something that most societies still regard as ethically or morally high up there, but from an energetic point of view, are really darknesses, such as love with sacrifice, the victimizer, you know, where we idealize the victim in us and use this as a justification for you know, hidden darkness, revenge, or you know, somebody else owing us something, where we use this for push pull and emotional manipulation. And Cindy, this then answers your question. Push pull and emotional manipulation, love hate relationships are part of our shadow, of our ego shadow. The more covert they are, the more white shadow they become. All right, so you know, love with sacrifice as an archetypal sort of manipulation game and push pull game, you know, sort of where you sacrifice yourself for somebody else and then you use it against them, either for guilt tripping or blame shifting, is probably one of the most common unidentified shadow traits in our societies. And I wanted to, we're running out of time, but I wanted to zoom through this here real quick with what the victimizer means, and again, an arbitrary term that shows the mechanism of how we can, you know, get pulled into from victim into perpetrator, and hover sort of in between both through our white shadow notions, namely the fixer, the rescuer, and the healer. Okay, because there's a very distinct egotistical payoff in that, namely, of course, manipulation. So you did this to me, and therefore you owe me, or you must do this for me. Okay. Also, of course, in its sort of even more covert forms, like you owe me attention, or you need to give me attention, or you need to give me validation. All right. So it's the unconscious return, an expectation or gratification that keeps us in either of these roles, you know, if we identify with it. This is a very complex subject, and it's very difficult to heal. There's very few therapists in this world that can actually pinpoint this. Energy work is really the only the methodology that can show us this in a person. So you see that shadow traits are very complex, and the white shadow traits, here just to name a few more of these archetypes, the resentful provider, the world savior. So he's a covert grandiosity in the saving the world, needing to show truth or light to other people, needing to heal everyone. But also other more hidden expressions in form of self-hatred, self-disgust. And the fragile darkness as in like, oh, it's a combination of the victimizer and, literally competing to be sort of the biggest victim, and proving that your suffering is worse than other people's suffering, and therefore they need to give you something that you're entitled. So fragile darkness is often comes with sort of entitlement. So archetypes of dark and white shadow here, just a few. Many of you are in the Sacred Self-Healing course, so you're already familiar with this, but this is an overview here. The dark shadow archetypes in our sort of sociological and our 3D life are common expressions of the tyrant husband or the tyrant leader or tyrant president or CEO or something, the manipulative wife or manipulative organizations, fake news and so forth, sneaky thief or conman, anything that has to do with schemes. The sexual predator is pretty much all present in marketing everywhere, almost part of normal, or part of our perception of normal, unfortunately. So is the needy victim. It's very rewarded in our society to be a victim. It's a form of matrix control manipulation to basically make people compete about who's the bigger victim. Then they never really try to break out. It can be very dark in relationships because it comes with this entitlement that I've already mentioned, and of course one very popular expression of this, right, or popular only because of the rising awareness about it, is the narcissist. White shadow expressions in archetypes here in our 3D life and sociology is this sort of Mr. Nice Guy, Miss Goody Two Shoes, this perfectionism and performance-oriented fake nicety, okay, and goodness. White Knight in shining armor, or the princess. Again, here those are archetypes. The damsel in distress is a manipulation, covert manipulation a game, and the White Knight in shiny armor, breeds the resentful provider who feels like he constantly has to rescue or provide for somebody who's in distress. The perfect mom, the perfect dad, the perfect family, breeds family secrets, often covers very dark mechanisms that are going on, but even things such as the elephant, sort of, things that are being kept in darkness with a sort of squeaky clean exterior. And also the pathologies of that, obviously, that one is suppressed in even expressing things that are not perfect. All right. And then again here, the perfect provider, healer, or fixer, this is a new age occurrence, really, the people, that present themselves as sort of the biggest healers, who are deeply resentful, judgmental, and degrading towards others. So white shadow aspects always come with a fake front. Okay, just to give you the overview here. Now, summarizing, there are in this context now, we've learned that there are different types of darkness. There's some that can come from within ourselves and some that come from the outside. And the mechanisms of that are very complex, which will be covered in the next self-mastery class. But we can already see here, and Cindy, you commented on this earlier, how this all ties together. Inner darkness is really the expression of our own ego, coping mechanism, of our shadow, of our trauma, of our karmic stuff, of illness, of imbalance, temporary or chronic, of kind of fixation or idealization, of temptation, you know, addictive structure and payoffs fall into this category. And now also new phenomenon as a result of untrained energetic sensitivity. There's a lot of people out there who think that they are dark because of what they're seeing, and that's only because they don't know really what it is that they're seeing. It looks like angels and demons, and it drives them into insanity, but only because they are not trained in discerning that. So here is also, as you know, big part of my body of work is focused around that and helping people to contextualize this better, and also augmenting current dominating psychological and concepts or categories in psychiatry, to augment them, you know, and to make therapists understand that just because a person sees darkness doesn't mean that they're hallucinating. So this will be a subject of our next self-mastery class. And outer darkness obviously has to do with exposure. We talked a little bit about this today. It has to do with increased susceptibility, can have to do with codes, packs, vows. Codes would be the, you know, the sort of like actual the 3D manifestation, but there's also energetic manifestations of outer darkness that is not so easy to understand, as you know, the existence of pacts or vows, and maybe past life related karmic aspects fall into this as well, and the whole entire sort of subject of beings, entities, and fields. Concluding here real quick, because we have to come to an end. Inner darkness and shadow calibrate as far as like an energy level is concerned, very low, and the energetic stress and conflict levels that a person subjectively experiences very high. It's like the most conflicted and fragmented state that somebody can be in. It leads to destructiveness and violence and physical, emotional, and mental health issues if not treated, if not healed. Okay, I'm not going to go through the ego payoffs. We've covered most of them. The holistic causes of darkness are complex, and mostly, but we've already filtered this: an attachment or an illusion of control, not knowing how to trust, not wanting to move forward, like maintaining things, and as opposed to evolving. Fear, you know, very strong fear of own darkness or shadow, idealization and externalization. That is the category of religious programming. Skewed sense of self or destroyed sense of self. This can be sometimes the consequence of abuse. For instance, inability to accept unknown and the unknown and its own mortality, and not accepting limitations. You know, I just realized as I'm reading this that I've forgot to mention the most common cause, and that is disconnection. You know, of all, disconnection from all, really, but light and life is basically the core course. The healing, the energetic healing resonances that are needed to overcome inner darkness can be taught and also cultivated through practicing being present, yeah, meditation, mindfulness, and so forth, learning to accept limitations, and refocusing on expansion. And through that refocusing and reprioritizing, we can gain trust and hope, you know, which can then lead to the higher to these higher vibratory resonances to grip, namely really surrender, you know, accepting that I'm human, and seeing what choices I have, seeing, you know, that there is a courage in me that if I just align myself to that. And yeah, it comes with you know, aspects of self accountability. I have to inhabit myself. I have to like really be myself and learn to appreciate all expressions and all experiences as learning experiences, which then allows me to go into deeper forms of forgiveness and the experience of beauty and joy. Okay, so those are the healing resonances that, in that order, need to be applied. And here in practical self-healing is basically the process of reconnecting, and then ultimately, all the things that one encounters that then need to be mastered. Okay, so the self-mastery strategy for overcoming inner darkness and shadow is shown here. It goes through these stages that we have here and there illuminated as we have been talking about our own experiences in part 1, and also here today in part 2. All right, everyone, I hope that this gave you a good overview of what you're actually dealing with when it comes to darkness and shadow, especially the inner darkness aspects. I hope this was helpful. And you can already tell these are very complex subjects, and they grab deep into some of our programming. So it's always a bit iffy to talk about these things without, triggering fear or things in people. So my way of approaching this, as you can see, is very careful and deliberate. So as you are your own self-healers and healers for others, I want to remind you to proceed with the same reverence and caution and deliberate remembrance in a person to always focus them on their light, okay, and to make sure that the temporary absence of light, what the person subjectively experiences, darkness, is not a permanent state. It is just an energy, and all energies can transform, which means that everything can be healed. All right. So this is hopefully here the conclusion that you take from all this education and self-reflection. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for contributing. And next time we are going to talk about delusions, outer darkness, and the self-healing strategies with the confrontation of actual darkness. So you will see me there become even more careful and go deeper into energetic and etheric protection and defense. Bye, everyone. See you soon.